hit record and we just go with it. Normally, and
I
you'll
just
see
feel
it.
like I should start singing because I have a microphone.
Look, I'm not going to stop you from singing. Seriously, this is totally fine. This is
Will you sing with me?
I will sing with you. I mean, look at it. Like, we've got a beautiful night. We are covered in, you can see the thing that they've got there, which would normally be the Opera House. So we did have that kind of view there. When I did this with Nick and Arturo, that wasn't there. But it's the Women's World Cup, so we can't say, no to that. They get first dibs. If we were filming out there, we might cover them, but they're further.
No criticism of having that beautiful view blocked by women's soccer.
Yeah, exactly. So that's fine. Hi, it's Mark here from the AusDeFi Association, as well as the DSAI, the Data Science and AI community. This is a podcast as one of the series of new things that you're going to get from the AusDeFi YouTube channel. So we're doing much more emerging tech, and what better a guest than a group, founder of a group that is doing a whole lot in AI and Web3 from Stirling Rose, Natasha Blycha. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great for you to be here and stuff. I think that a lot of people are really excited about the crossover between AI and Web3 and trying to figure it out. And you're seeing it from a legal perspective. But before we get into it, can we get a bit of your background, how you got into this space? Where did it all kind of start from? What's your origin story?
Oh gosh, where do I start? There was a twinkle in my father's eye. Is that where I start?
Please, yeah. And that was only like 20 years ago or so?
Oh, darling. No, so, became a lawyer decades ago. And, I mean, my origin story's out there a little bit already, but I'll try to do a compressed version. Got pregnant relatively early, so left the law to have my first baby, and then in rapid succession had 3 more children. So I had 4 children in, I think it was probably about 7 years. So actually took 10 years off the law to be a stay-at-home mum.
Wow, I do not know that.
Yes,
amazing.
That's all true. And also am married to a partner at another law firm. So also didn't just sit at home per se. We actually travelled and lived all over the world with my husband, being a lawyer, and me, just looking after these small humans, which has proved to be a very fruitful and wonderful thing to do.
No pressure on those kids with 2 lawyers as parents. No pressure at all.
Pressure. Feel the pressure, children. Anyway, so then after that time, and when I got my youngest Arthur into pre-primary, I was rejoicing because I had only really stayed out of the workforce, because when I first had my first children, it's not like now where people did part-time work.
Yeah.
I was the first person in my law firm as a non-partner who was even given 4 days a week. So I'm kind of like a little bit old school, a little bit shoulder pads old school, but not quite, really in the trenches of feminism, but still a little bit difficult. And then so Arthur went to school, and I was so excited because I could go back to the law. So I never
Amazing.
left the law.
It's always been there.
It's always been there. It's just I was prioritising my children, and also because, you couldn't do both very easily at that time. So back to lawyering, went back to Herbert Smith Freehills, and had a pretty good run. They were very generous with me. I often like to say I was probably quite difficult because I was older and a bit bolshier. But I suppose the origin moment was when you have 10 years off.
Yep.
You do look with quite different eyes when you come back.
Okay.
And one thing that had been wonderful is I really love reading, as most people who know me know that. Mm-hmm. And I really read very widely while I was off, and including about technology. So when I came back, I was quite surprised to see very little had actually changed
Wow.
from when I'd left.
Okay.
And I knew there was these things called smart contracts, and I knew there was blockchains and these things, but there was no real difference. And this is, not just HSF, this is all law firms. There was no real difference. Mm-hmm. So then, I basically just started to gather like-minded people around me, and we started talking about smart legal contracts, and one thing led to another. And by the end of my time at Herbert Smith Freehills, I was running the global digital law group across 15 global offices. So
amazing.
It's quite a... from sort of being someone who was sort of looking after nappies and small children. By the end of my time there, I really was, flying all around the world, leading the most clever, amazing lawyers from all over our networks. And it was huge learning opportunities, and an opportunity not just to look at smart legal contracts, not just to look at crypto assets, but actually looking at the edge of where all emerging technology was. And I like to say I was very lucky at HSF because we had access to some of the most senior experts in all different disciplines, and because the team I ran was horizontal, that meant that I was having access to the best clients in every industry.
Wow.
And having also access to some of, say, for example, the best regulatory lawyers who'd been doing it for 40 years. So a lot of exposure to very good technicians and very high-end clients, and also at that time getting to sit in the boardrooms and at the senior levels of clients who were going through digitisation strategies.
Yeah.
So really getting to hear that, even though I'm saying there was a lot of stuff on emerging tech, also hearing the very pragmatic and real boringness of, let's say, the more banal tech, like keeping the lights on and budgets and the real difficulties that were facing the procurement teams and, just the board level, general boring stuff. So in all of that mix, you sort of, I think by nature, some people would call me an entrepreneur at that point.
Okay. Yeah.
But that it's a natural evolution to say, well, what comes next? So what came next is always got a bit of a side gig of a tech company. So working on smart legal contracts with a company called Nurium. Whether that's a side gig or full-time gig, I'm still not quite sure. But also got together with a few of people I considered in my journeys who were the smartest lawyers that I know in this space, and sort of just, I suppose, invited them to come on a bandit's journey of being a startup serving startups. So that's the origin story of Stirling Rose.
Amazing.
And I suppose a bit of my origin story too.
And we've had one of your colleagues, the great James Myans, on the show as well for one of the first Rants and Raves. And I do want to get into ranting and raving with you. I think we were a bit subdued also because at the time we only did 15 minutes or so. We had limited time. The camera was running out in terms of, we just filmed the podcast before and still kind of new to this space. But we didn't get to rant and rave as much, but today because this week where we've got the Digital Asset Conference, so this is coming to you from the same week that this is all being filmed. We were just at the breakfast before, there were some other sessions on, and you ran a session as well at the CSIRO. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Can do. So again, one of the things we do is we get exposed to multiple jurisdictions in terms of emerging tech, but also multiple technologies. And one of the things that we look at is the convergence of multiple technologies. And in this instance, oftentimes in industries, you sort of have, there's people who are the blockchain people, or they're the digital asset people, and then you'll go into another piece of government reform, and that'll be for the digital identity people. And then there's, government roundtables right now for the AI people. And when you sit, especially as an emerging tech lawyer, you're in all those rooms. Yeah. And it becomes quite clear that the convergence between those different modalities and different tech, they're very important parts of the same conversation. And that same conversation, if you want my rant to start.
Please, yeah.
There is a big foundational meta, both legal and social concern that I have is that we're effectively making digital twins of humanity. And that has implications in respect of how we use AI. That's got implications in respect of how we perceive ourselves and our own personhood. It's got implications certainly of how we adjudicate and timestamp that, which is a blockchain question. And it has a phenomenal impact on how we use money and what we use to actually transact in this new realm and our traditional realm, which ends up dealing with lots of regulatory questions around financial products and also deals with the future of money in banking and non-banking sector and fintech. But all of those things actually need to be looked at together. And when we just look at them in single modalities, I think we're making policy in a vacuum. And that's probably something that I find quite, I don't want to say stressful, that's an overstatement. But
it's ranting and raving. We can overstress it. That's fine.
That's fine. So
It's interesting because people do wonder, how does blockchain help AI? How does AI help blockchain? I think the latter is clearer for many because they've clearly seen in their own industry how AI is this efficiency gain tool. And immediately you go, well, I don't understand how smart contracts work. I can dump it into ChatGPT or other GPT with all the privacy turned on and explain it to me like a 5-year-old. So we can see the efficiency gains there. The reverse is interesting as well, and we've been lucky enough to be able to start building and playing around in how does blockchain secure the data models and make it auditable. And if you've got a data model where you can't share all of the information, well, zero knowledge proofs could be used to timestamp, and if there are changes, tell you that there's a change without having to share sensitive data. So we're seeing interesting things like that in your journey, and because you guys are also building stuff as well with that other company, Norium, but in the startups that you are talking to and the ones that you're just exposed to, being in the rooms that you're in, are you seeing interesting things being built in the space that cross over, where the concentric circles, like you said, this is not just a vacuum, it's not just a blockchain thing or this tech, it's multiple pieces of it being used. What are you seeing out there that's interesting?
It's real. So the Venn diagram is collapsing on this.
Interesting.
And I say that with trepidation, because even when you say that there's some groundswell between AI and blockchain, you will get pushback, particularly from people who are technical experts in blockchain.
Yeah.
But the truth is, the places, well, first of all, there's always different definitions of blockchain. So if you come with a very narrow definition of blockchain and a very narrow definition of digital asset, you may say, well, that's not my experience of Ethereum, for example. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yep.
Where we're seeing there, if you take the most expensive view of blockchain to mean distributed ledger technology, if you even go so far as to say something that in some circles may be considered highly contentious, that digital assets don't even need a blockchain.
Ooh.
There, then you can really open up the discussion about the use of AI in digital assets and the use of AI potentially in types of distributed ledger technology. So where am I seeing clients do that, and where have we experimented with that? And that is inside the belly of the assets themselves.
Okay.
So also, obviously, people have been using AI forever, and it's just got sexy again with the releases from OpenAI and ChatGPT. But transformer models, large language models, have been around for a long time, not as long as narrow AI. But when it comes to generative AI, something has shifted. And that is that the general population now feels that it has a grasp of this technology. And there's almost like a mushrooming that's taking place, and an accessibility that wasn't there before. So inside the belly of the assets themselves, we are seeing people basically use co-pilot style tools inside digital assets, and another place that we see a rich source of AI use is also in the oracles which feed into blockchains.
Interesting.
Whether or not you would use AI in a blockchain itself, I'm quite bullish on saying you would.
Yep.
Not on the current models necessarily, but the platforms of the future. Anything that is data collecting is actually an instrument to remember and to cast that memory of data use forward to create future flows or patterns. So the idea that we all talk about, that somehow there will be autonomous organisations in the future, or decentralised autonomous organisations, I see a collapse sometimes between the platforms, the entities, the assets sometimes even, and the oracles. So in my entire worldview of AI, I think AI will be in everything, the same way as often we have a bit of silicon in everything now.
Yeah.
You will have AI in your fridge, you'll have AI in you. And whether that's happening in the next 2 years or whether it's 15 years, you should expect AI to be ubiquitous in everything, including blockchains.
We're still learning a lot about AI, and I guess the next question is going to go to that. And pause, I'm going to cut there and then do another, just in case these cut out, and we're going well so far, battery's good. All right, so you had mentioned definitions as being something that's important. So let's talk about generative versus narrow AI. What are your, you know what, actually I just got paranoid again. This is my ADD. It is recording.
It's good.
Because I can't see the red thing. Eventually I'm going to have it hooked up so I can see it on the laptop. I don't have that yet.
darling.
bit
It's
by
fine
bit.
me.
3, 2, 1. So one of the things that you had mentioned was that definitions, and I agree, whether it's AI or blockchain or anything emerging tech or anything you're trying to put rules around, we need to agree upon the definitions. Let's talk about generative versus narrow AI. In your mind, what do you think of those two, and how do you want people to think about that?
Okay, so you asked me before to sort of give the 5-year-old explanation.
Please.
I'll try to do that, and I forgive me anyone who's heard me give this very cheesy explanation of the difference between the two, but I do find it quite helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So with narrow AI, it's domain specific, and let's picture, if you will, a shoe cupboard. So inside a cupboard, you've got multiple types of different shoes. Some may be sneakers, some may be red shoes, green shoes, high heels, children's shoes. And inside the cupboard, let's say we use narrow AI, the narrow AI allows us to see patterns in the cupboard. So imagine that cupboard has, even 1 billion shoes. It's very useful to say, well, the likelihood is every 4th shelf, you've got 3 blue shoes.
Okay.
Really useful, okay?
Yeah.
But also, I needed to do some tagging in there. I needed to tag the blue shoes, so you knew that it was going to be a blue shoe. We've all been doing that when we've logged into things and we've said, this is a traffic light. This is the tagging.
Yeah.
Okay,
We've been training the AI.
The gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So that's narrow AI. What happened with the large language models, and really the most common way that people think about this is ChatGPT, but GPT is a large language model, is another name for generative AI. There's lots of generative AI that's out there. Facebook has their generative AI, Google has their generative AI, but the point I'm making earlier is you're going to have generative AI in lots of different things, but at the moment it's housed with some big corporate houses, including Microsoft, who
Yep.
have the cut-in deal with OpenAI. So let's take that example of the shoes again and the shoe cupboard. The shoe cupboard is now the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's use OpenAI. What they did is they scraped the entire internet. So you're not just looking with a very small lens into a very specific domain, you're looking at the whole world. And the data in the cupboard is the whole world. And that means it also includes trees and furniture and people and what they're doing and what they're thinking. And the word generative is key here, because what you have is somebody prompting or asking a question. And in this case, I'd like to say the question is, make me a pair of shoes that are red shoes, that are children's shoes, that are high heels. And the generative AI creates you the new shoes. So do you hear the difference? The first one is you're looking at patterns, you're establishing patterns, whereas the second one, combined with user input, with a much bigger data set, a generalist data set, actually creates you or generates you something new. So that's quite a substantive difference to put in the hands of consumers. And of course, these products are generative AI products. What's happening now is the race that we're putting those things inside corporations, and people paying a lot of money to be the first people to use these models. But we can also build our own large language models reasonably easy. There's some that are open source, and they don't have quite as many parameters as, say, GPT-4, which we understand that the word on the street has about 1 trillion parameters, but you can get away with 16 million parameter large language models, which is probably better for energy use. And there's a lot of biffing about which ones are better and more efficient anyway. But you can see quite a different output, and there's a reason that especially the interface for ChatGPT was so simplistic that it made people feel that it was certainly more accessible. Most people are using it they're not creating shoes, high heel baby shoes, they're using it to create Word documents. But if you're a computer scientist or a developer, you can sure as anything you're using Copilot in Discord to create your coding. And for example, we would use Midjourney, which is also using GPT under the hood, to create all our images. Similarly, people will be seeing that the new shoe that you're creating may be a video, or it may be something that's never existed before.
We're seeing it just evolve really fast. And I remember when it first came out and people were doing, okay, create a poem, or write this in the style of pirate, or something, or say this as if Donald Trump or 50 Cent was saying it, et cetera, or Snoop Dogg. And it was just really interesting how playful people were being with it. And then we started to get a little bit more serious. And then the different models started coming out, and ChatGPT was releasing newer features, the most recent one being custom instructions, where you can pre-load it with a bit of background on who you are and how you want it to act. Given the rapid pace of evolution of the things that are going on in this space, do you think that are we being cautious enough? Like, a lot of people worry about like the AI ethics, and we see regulation, and we'll get to that kind of topic. But do you think that we're going too fast and not being cautious enough? Do you think that it's a bit more, we need to be pragmatic? Or what do you think about like this fast pace that we're going on right now? It seems like every week there's something new.
Gosh, that is a very difficult question. So, is it risky? Absolutely yes. No doubt about it. I think of it almost in a risk register in my mind.
Okay.
And I would say that the top right corner of existential risk is there. And I think I'm in reasonably good company.
Is that Terminator at the top right?
Yeah, there's Terminator at the top. Well, there's what they call out-of-the-box scenarios.
Okay, yeah.
But are they likely?
That's the thing.
That's different. But, on your risk register, if something's not very likely but highly impactful, it still gets read on the risk register.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, but there's far smaller harms along the way which we need to pay attention to. And one of the ones that people can viscerally understand is this idea of deep fakes. So your you-ness and who you are, particularly since we've got very used to consuming each other through a digital screen. So if your job could be consumed through a screen, and if I'm able to reproduce you through surveilling you for a period of time. So if you doing your job, I watch you and listen to you and see your output for 400 hours, theoretically I can actually reproduce you saying, for voice, I only need a few seconds to be able to reproduce your
11
voice.
Labs is doing that kind of stuff, and then Meta's coming up with something that needs even less seconds.
Correct.
It's crazy.
But in terms of the more, obviously with data, the more data you put in, the closer it can get to being a true representation of you. You yourself, whether it's important that it's a true representation of you or it's an amalgam of you and lots of other data or biometric movement. So that should really concern people.
Yeah.
And I think it does concern people. And then if you look at the thing about AI is it helps us to do really great things really quickly and at volume, more efficiently. There's excellent data on it. Here's a terrible thing to say. It makes not very clever people more clever, and it makes clever people marginally more clever.
Would not disagree with that. We are certainly seeing that on Twitter.
But the harms that it can reproduce also can reproduce at pace and volume. So when I use this deep fake example, we're seeing cybersecurity hacks. We're seeing the rise of, spam that's coming into your inbox every day. A lot of that is actually being supported by the use of generative AI. So I can enlarge the size of the harm that I wish to perpetrate against you using AI. But I'm not all doom and gloom in it. But the question that you have is actually about regulation.
Yeah.
Then.
Yep.
So how do you not button down the amazing people bringing these pieces together? How do you not button down the efficiency uplift? Because I love using these tools. At our firm, we use large language models on a daily basis for lots of different things. So
and the website, the new website that you've got is looking amazing with the imagery that's there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ty.
Thank you, Ty. So we couldn't have done that if we weren't using these new tools. So it would be silly to just say, oh my God, turn off all AI immediately.
Pause for 6 months
Pause
like
for
that.
6 months. And then the question is, of course, well, how on earth do you regulate it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the million,
That's
billion,
$1 million
trillion dollar question.
And if you don't know the answer, that's the right answer, in my opinion.
Okay.
So the way that the world is going about this, the most prominent discussion and the most visually well, the most visible, I should say, law is the EU AI Act.
Yes.
Okay, and that's been around for a very long time. And the early drafts, it certainly wasn't developed for generative AI. Okay, it was developed in the milieu where we only had narrow AI really in public consciousness.
So a few years ago, they were looking at this.
Quite right. It's been in the work for a long time. It's a risk-based law, so very similar to sort of your GDPR style law, where it's seeing what are the harms that could be perpetrated if it's low risk, medium risk, or high risk, and then sort of prohibiting very high risk behaviours. So the AI doesn't have to actually do anything wrong for there to be a punishment in a risk-based regime. So the problem to the extent there's a problem or there's criticism of the EU AI Act, and first, it's not in operation yet anyway, it's still got a little bit of work to do to make its way through the nation states of the EU, is that it was developed for narrow AI, which means that some of the things that it thinks are important, coming back to our example of the shoe cupboard, is saying, well, do you have a fulsome, non-discriminatory data set of shoes? Okay, but once it's the whole world you're looking at, maybe that's not the right question.
Yeah, how do you even enforce and control that? Yeah.
And the other thing is when you get to generative AI, there's a number of people involved in the process of producing what may be a risky behaviour or a non-risky behaviour. So the same tool in one hand can produce something completely innocuous and in another hand do something quite dangerous. So you can hear there's multiple layers of a tech stack. You can hear there's multiple people involved in that tech stack, and those people over time may in fact not be people. They may be their own digital twins or triplets or whatever. So right now, taking the approach of saying we're going to just be very explicit and moderate the risk, is it dangerous to do that? I don't think it's dangerous, but there's a part of me suspects that it's not that different to if we'd come up with a computer law and said we're going to have a law about computers. It's particularly when this point that AI will be in everything. So what I do think is superior potential way to deal with this is to actually look at all existing laws and look at outcomes. So that would be to do a full legislative review in every country, not just in Australia, and that there's precedent for that. So I know that, may have been 20 years ago, we did a competitive neutrality review, which is just look at every piece of legislation, regulation, and say, does the government have an advantage in providing these services, a commercial advantage? So, we have done this before. So when you do that, you might look at the corporations law and say, okay, well, what happens in here if we now have decentralised autonomous organisations? Do we need to change the definition of person in the Corporations Act to allow for a generative AI tool or an AI tool to be a person? Do we need to move on some of the legal definitions of when we have some kind of civil or criminal penalty that require intent? Because we can't ascribe intent to a machine. So there's some very significant and thorny and difficult legal questions that absolutely can't be solved by one horizontal piece of legislation. Then the counter is people don't have hard law, they have soft law. So you might see someone like Singapore has got guidelines, and the US has done the same thing. It's got its digital Bill of Rights. So they are trying to, it's a thing. It's like, okay, well, we're trying to deal with it by saying, here's some parameters that a good corporation or good individuals will adhere to when they want to do ethical AI. But if you rant about that, then you can say, well, God, what does ethical, in our day and age, what does being ethical even mean?
Ethical, and in terms of how ChatGPT is right now, it is very westernized. Many people would agree that. Sam Altman did his 28-city, 22-country, 4-week world tour recently. He was in Melbourne, and he said there that they've learned, one of the biggest takeaways was that they've seen that ChatGPT, at least OpenAI, doesn't have and take into account the culture, history, and norms of different societies. For one example, the hello, the token for that, is less tokens than it is for konnichiwa, even though they mean the same thing. So it's more costly in Japanese to use OpenAI. Potentially, we don't know all the words. This is just one small sample, but it's interesting when you don't take out those things into account. And culture is definitely a big part of it. I think it's going to be interesting how this plays out,
Well, I
especially here
mean,
in Australia as well.
That's right, but there are obviously large language models coming out of the big tech companies out of China as well, for example. And I should add that China is probably another country that's already developed a hard AI Act.
Interesting.
But they haven't, I don't think that's, the last time I checked, it's not actually, it's not been approved. But it has some very interesting things in there, which is saying things like, you can't do anything that goes against public policy. You can't use a generative model to have any sexual or deviant type behaviours. So there's, there's things.
All those OnlyFans creators that want to have their digital twin.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there is responses everywhere. Does anyone have the answer? I don't know. Right now, the Australian government is doing some roundtables to try to talk to people from industry, and I think that I'm quite heartened actually to hear there's the right group mix of technicians, lawmakers, policymakers, industry experts that are coming together. And I don't say this often, but I would say that I'm quite heartened that those conversations seem very pragmatic and very sensible.
Very good to hear. We like the word pragmatic. All right, I'm going to do another pause and then let's get into something more about, and we will have to because... All right, so let's take a look at inside the cool crystal ball. We got James to do this as well. Let's do it more from the AI kind of angle. Where do you see us heading in the future? And you can choose. You can do, if you want to do multiple, short term, you feel it's like this, medium, it's like that, longer term, or if you can choose one of those, and it doesn't just have to be here at Australia, it could be global, whatever you feel like. What's something that you feel you can talk about or rant or rave about in terms of the crystal ball?
So I think that, again, not necessarily putting time horizons on these things,
Yep.
but these things to me are inevitable. That is, we will progress from external tech to wearable tech to implantable tech. And see the Apple Vision Pro, it's not quite out there to the markets yet, but that's a real step. So this concept now where you see a laptop or an iPhone, that's not how we're going to interact with tech or AI in the future. It will be integrated with us, which is another reason why I see a problem with the othering approach of the AI Act of the risk is in you as well as outside of you. So that's one. The second thing that I think will happen is that we will be perpetually in some kind of augmented reality. So I think that our children and our children's children will experience, we saw the very first of that on Pokemon.
Yep, Pokemon Go.
Pokemon Go. But effectively, because of the use of these sort of, as we sort of move with this Apple Vision Pro, to whatever comes next with that, you shouldn't expect to just see what's in your analog environment. You will be marketed to perpetually, and that marketing will probably be bespoke based on your parameters that you're moving around with.
It's like a Minority Report. We kind of saw a little bit of that when he's walking around.
And honestly, when you see the Apple Vision Pro and the way that you can do things with your fingers in the air, it's not that far off Minority Report. And where all of that goes, the crystal ball for me is that I don't necessarily say it's a human right to have disconnection, but I do think it's a fundamental need for people to disconnect from tech.
Yep.
So we know that there is some unhealthiness that's gone along with our tech addiction, and I use the word addiction intentionally. So we've done some work at Stirling Rose, a pro bono campaign on digital-free national parks.
Yep, love this.
And this is the idea that national parks have got to have their next evolution. They've only been around for a couple, or not even a couple of hundred of years, I think that's right. John Muir came about, Scottish guy, did the first one in Yosemite in the States. So it's actually a relatively new concept, but people take it for granted, but we know we love it, right? So if you inside the national park footprint had a selection of digital-free national parks, that is places, I'm going to say remain disconnected. And I use that language also intentionally because at the moment you think, oh my God, what would happen if there was no connectivity? But the truth is there is, in a lot of places there still is disconnection.
Yeah.
But we often only worry about getting to more connection. We're not spending a lot of time thinking about, will I be able to disconnect? If it's implanted in me, can I even if I want to? can I get a reality check, or am I always going to have other fragments around me?
We don't have to worry about that choice at the moment, like whether or not we have the choice, because it's just inherent. But in the future, it might not be.
That's right. You now say, put your phone away. But
Yeah.
what happens if your phone is in you?
Yeah.
So anyway, so digital free national parks, I'm extremely passionate about them. And, I would like to, it's not something that we hold very tightly. We have just had someone who's come to us, a uni student, and said, can I do some short stories on this and make videos? And we've said, go for your life, because the concept's out there, people, to do what you want with it. But we would like to see legislation effectively. The way you get to digital free national parks is we will have to work on satellites. So in low Earth orbit, also a problem, talk to a space lawyer, anyone involved in this area, there's a massive problem coming with the economy making of low Earth orbit. So if you're going to have lots of satellites there, you will have perpetual connectivity below. We will need to make some laws that change or basically ask satellites to be turned off between sort of spatial coordinates to allow for that digital disconnection.
It's a fascinating world, and usually when I ask this kind of stuff, even when I've been asked this kind of stuff, I think maybe like, okay, next year I believe, or by the end of this year, this is stuff that, look, it sounds like science fiction, and it sounds kind of, some people might think crazy, but also commerce on the internet was crazy. Cars were a crazy thing, I'm sure. And it's interesting that we see that we think within the realms of what we know. The first cars, they look like horse and carriage without the horse, right? We couldn't imagine that far. So it's amazing to see that you guys are thinking that far. If people are really interested in getting involved, learning more, getting your help with the things that they're looking at in this space, what's the best way for them to get in touch, and where are you guys all based? I know you travel a bit, but can you tell us a bit more?
So we've got offices in Sydney and Perth, but we do work all over the world. So we consider ourselves a legal policy institute as well as a law firm. So we help out globally. I spend a lot of time in Europe, a lot of time in Australia. But Stirling and Rose, www.stirlingandrose.com,
in the show notes.
And also www.digitalfreenationalparks.com.
We'll put that into.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. Well, Natasha, thank you so much for your time today, ranting and raving, and we'll see you on your travels.
Thank you very much.